So a common argument amongst the right wing is that the state is a monopoly on force, and that's why they only focus on the state when it comes to the application of force. Unfortunately, they fail to comprehend some of the most obvious subject matters in between their, charade of, oh, we're against violence and force to initiate the rule of law. Number one, if you're going to determine that private enterprise creates competitive force and that somehow this makes it less force than if it were under the guise of a state, then is it not still a monopoly? For example, on a forum where you can get banned at for absolutely everything and nothing, is that not a monopoly of force? Within the structure of the forum itself, is it not a monopoly of force that a moderator gets to dictate every facet of every single person on that forum? So just because there are other forums, suddenly it's not a monopoly of force. I guess that means that the state is still less of a monopoly because there are less nations than there are forums. And therefore, all these forums are their own benign monopolies of force as opposed to the 200 some nations that exist on the planet. A lot of them are unionized and under the banner of a more united force. So, like, United States has a federal government, there's Europe, and there's the UN, and things like that. So there's less force in the sense of there are less people applying force. It is a more, universal force that encompasses more people and applies more equally. Oh, what a concept. Equality. Equality breeds freedom by extension of if we're all equally treated as bad, it's not quite as bad. But, this concept is lost to the right wingers. And I just can't understand where their frame of mind comes from. Because, force, the concept of law and the application of law is not the same thing as an economy. Nobody likes monopolies. I'm sure there's a few fascists who will, endorse monopolies, and even libertarians are okay with monopolies so long as it's under the guise of free market. If they did it the way libertarians are okay with, then there's nothing wrong with the monopoly itself, and thus shows the true nature of libertarianism. But when you get right down to it, government is not the same as a business, and therefore different rules apply. It's a completely different spectrum, has completely different standards. The idea that somehow we can compare the monopoly of force to the same monopoly of a business is ridiculous. Because the reason we're against monopoly is because they can apply force. And if a business is a monopoly, it has a monopoly over the market, it has a monopoly over labor, it has a monopoly over land. And this is what applies force. It doesn't necessarily mean that if a state is a monopoly, that it is a monopoly on the land and the people and the labor. It simply means it is a monopoly on the rules applied to the land, the people, and the labor. You see what I'm saying? Now, if you want to argue that we should live in a stateless society, that's one thing. But to say that we should replace the state with private capital and just create private states is just benign and asinine. It's asinine that you would tell me that somehow there is going to be less force applied to me when I fucking live it every day. I go on the internet. I see what anarcho-capitalism and libertarianism does to people. I see how people act when they're under the impression that just because they own something, they can get away with something. And that's not the kind of world I want to live in. And guess what? When you go outside, that's pretty much the world you live in. It's not quite as bad as on the internet, but that's because we have a public state. That is because we have that monopoly on force. And if there was even less of a state than now, it would be even fucking worse. So the answer clearly isn't more privatization, it's less. And preferably, rather than it belong to the state, it belongs to the people at large. That's what communism is all about. Now, whether or not that could actually be applied, or inevitably the people are idiots, and anyone that stages the revolution will either be corrupted or is initially corrupt, or whatever, I'm not here to argue with you about that. What I'm arguing with you about is the fact that you cannot say with a straight face that somehow private capital does not use force, and that by the very nature of private capital, it cannot use force. Because it does. It always does. And, if you have a multitude of private enterprises, all with their own rules and sanctions and terms of service, guess what? It doesn't become a competition of force. To you, the worker, to you, the forum member, to you, the individual, you have to follow all those rules. A lot of the times, those rules contradict one another. You are in plight constantly. You are the one burdened with the responsibility of adhering to all these rules, or you get banned, you get fired, you this and that. And it's not them that has to suffer. They're the capital holders. They're the rules makers. It's you that has to suffer. And it doesn't fucking matter if at some point in your life you become one of the capital holders. Oh, make your own website. Oh, do this. Oh, do that. Why should I fucking have to? But that's not the point. The point is, for most people, you're gonna have to deal with this bullshit. You're gonna have to deal with this bullshit of everywhere you fucking go, there's someone ruling over you. Now, if we all had to live under the same ruler, yeah, it would suck, but it wouldn't suck as bad because the same rules would apply to everybody, including those that are officers or soldiers or things like that. Maybe they would get, a slap on the wrist, whereas we would go to jail over something, but the fact is, it would still be more equal by the very nature of that institution, by the very nature of the state. It breeds equality because it's that monopoly. Not a monopoly on land, but a monopoly on principle. So that's my argument against libertarians and anarcho-capitalists and mutualists and all that other bullshit. They're not anarchists, they're just anarcho-statists. They're just private statists. And that to me is many, many times worse than anyone that endorses a state outright, whether they be on the right or the left. So, I guess that's it for now.